afternoon, everyone. It's my privilege to welcome you to this session titled My Beautiful Japan. As someone who has both lived and worked in Japan, I am thrilled to guide this conversation as we delve into the many threads that connect and fascinate us all about the land of the rising sun. So let me begin with my very own Japan story. It happened soon after my arrival as the Consul General of India in Osaka, Kobe in 2009. It was the first party we were hosting at our house, and I had invited my deputy, Mr. Tripathi, to come to my house for dinner. So he arrived, he used to live in Osaka. So he arrived by train from Osaka to Kobe, to the station nearest to my house, and then he took a taxi. And he told the taxi driver, take me to the Indian Consul General's house. The taxi driver probably didn't hear him correctly or misinterpreted. He took him instead to the Indonesian Consul General's house. Of course, as soon as they saw the signboard, they realized their mistake. The taxi driver apologized profusely, and he said, very sorry, sumimasen, sumimasen. And then he says, please, now I will take you. And he eventually brought him to my house. So the taxi fare came to 1,700 yen, which is about $20 based on the exchange rate of that time. Now, of course, the exchange rate has gone through the roof, but at that time, this was about $20. So the taxi driver says, sir, I did not bring you to the right house the first time, so you don't have to pay me 1,700, you can pay me just 1,000 yen. So Mr. Tripathi pays him 1,000 yen. But that's not the end of the story. An hour later, the taxi driver returns. So I thought Mr. Tripathi must have left his umbrella or something in the taxi and he has come to return it. But the taxi driver had actually come to return the 1,000 yen. So Mr. Tripathi said, why are you returning this money? He says, no, sir, I took you to the wrong house. I shouldn't have taken money from you. Please take this 1,000 yen back. He says, no, I will not take it back because you spent your petrol, you spent your time. And in any case, 1,000 yen would be the normal fare if I had taken any other taxi. Then the taxi driver says, sir, for the last 1 hour, my conscience has been killing me. If you do not take this 1,000 yen back, I will never drive the taxi again in my life. Now, please tell me, where in the world can you find such a taxi driver? Answer, only in Japan. I think the Japanese sense of integrity, responsibility, and commitment to doing what is right is truly unmatched. It is these qualities, rooted in their culture and worldview, that make Japan one of the most unique countries on the planet. A place where individuals uphold honor and values in both their personal and professional lives, creating a society that operates with an extraordinary sense of order and respect. I'm sure Radhika Jha and Pallavi Aiyar, who have both lived and worked in Japan, have their own Japan stories to offer. So let's hear from them as we delve into the fascinating exploration of their experiences and insights. So let me begin with you, Pallavi. Now, one of the best things about Japan is the sense of safety and order and the remarkable fact that lost things are returned. As you have mentioned in your book, Orienting, 87.5% of money, cash, which is lost in Japan, is returned. I mean, I can name 15 other places, including some in our country, where the chance of losing money is minus 500%. You don't have to lose it, somebody will take it out. So what is it? How have the Japanese managed to cultivate such a strong sense of trust and responsibility in society?
Thank you, Ambassador Swarup, for that question. And absolutely, as I mentioned in my book, I think that Japan is really the country where what is lost is always found. It's almost impossible to be lost in Japan. And that was something I discovered very early on in my stay over there. I lived in Tokyo for 4 years, between 2016 and 2020, and virtually on the 4th day, that I had moved to this teeming megalopolis of 30 million people, Tokyo, I discovered to my horror one morning that my wallet was missing from my handbag. And I realized that I had been out and about the day before, and it must have slipped out. And I had taken numerous metros and been all over the city. And I was disconsolate because I had all these credit cards which now needed to be cancelled. And these were from banks in different parts of the the world, so it was going to be very difficult to kind of renew them. And I'd also just got my identity card that allowed me to be resident in Japan. This was going to be difficult to recover as well. And so I sort of looked thoroughly, I retraced my steps to no avail, and I was sitting at home disconsolately when a friend phoned me up and said, have you gone to your local Koban? And the Koban is basically this little police chowki, like a little police station that's manned by 2 people, and it's on every other street in Japan. And I remember saying, why would I go to the police? Because coming from India, you kind of avoid the police as much as you can. And why on earth would I go for a lost wallet to like my local police station? But because I didn't have much else to do, I went there with my husband. Neither of us spoke much Japanese. My husband had done a year of Japanese 10 years ago. So he kind of tried in his broken Japanese to explain what was going on. And it was as though these 2 policemen had suddenly become superheroes and sprouted capes, because they came to attention, produced all these forms. I filled them out. They started making all these phone calls. And then at some point, Julio said, I think they found your wallet. And I said, no, darling. It's like your bad Japanese, right? Like what they are saying is they'll try to find my wallet and perhaps get back to me. But in fact, my wallet had been found. It had been turned into another police station, and they were able to locate this within 30 minutes, which was basically as likely to happen in most countries as pigs are likely to sprout wings and fly around. So there really was this preternatural sense of things really getting lost, because you had this incredible sense of integrity within the community. And as you asked, I spent some time pondering why this might be the case. Is it that it's their diet? Does eating sushi make you particularly honest? Or is there something in their DNA? I mean, you have various cultural tropes within Japan, this Nihon Jinrong, which it sort of ascribe unique qualities to the Japanese race, to the Japanese people. I mean, to me, this can come across as quite racist, but you do have Japanese themselves saying that they are sort of unique from the rest of the world. But I don't think that honesty is baked into DNA. And I think the answer really lies in the kind of normalization of civic behavior. I mean, ultimately, if what goes around comes around, and you're taught this from a very young age to have a kind of hierarchy of concern, where your concern is not only towards yourself, but in a more sort of generalized way. I think ultimately it leads to a situation where you know that if you lose your wallet, somebody will turn it in, and then you will return the favor. And there's just a very strong sense of public-mindedness and group community orientation in Japan. And I think it's also, partly the reason why they don't speak loudly to disturb others, why they famously don't litter. All of this is part of this normalization of civic consciousness and civic behavior, which is far less common in the world than it should be.
Now, Radhika, your last 2 books, My Beautiful Shadow and The Hidden Forest, are both set in Japan with Japanese characters. In fact, they don't have a single Indian character at all. So what were the challenges of authentically portraying Japanese characters and settings as a non-Japanese author? And how has been the Japanese reaction to your books?
Well, it is very challenging to write about culture in a country which is not your own. And on the other hand, I think, when we read, we're all the time reading about cultures and countries and people that we know nothing about. And when you read that, you develop a certain empathy. And so I thought, well, those characters, they go into your head and they become a part of you, and you feel you kind of know that place. And I felt, and my way of dealing with going to a new country is I would start reading fiction from that country. And so I think those sounds, they start getting those people, those characters, certain characters start living with me. And as for writing, no, it was a big decision. But what I realized was that what I wanted to write about, no one had really written about. And for me, what's interesting about Japan is not so much that it is very different from other parts of the world. And I was thinking, I think India is also very different and has held on to a certain identity, and Japan also. But what struck me, what is always fascinating for me, is how how global capitalism affects a people and a culture, and how resistant is that culture, and how does it adapt and kind of take in. So, I mean, I think of it like a virus, so you get this virus that comes into you, and then your body learns to cope with the virus, and you change. And also, but the virus also kind of becomes domesticated and changes its character. So I was trying to kind of understand in both these books how in Japan the virus of global capital was digested. And so one side of it was My Beautiful Shadow, which was really about consumerism. And I think in Japan it's very interesting because you see they were the first to fall into this whole personal debt trap. Because after 2000, when these people, when there was the whole real estate crash, then there was this kind of push, what they're doing in China today, which is to say, oh, personal consumption, that will hold everything up. And so, and then at the same time, there's a thing of capitalism and the work culture that created, which Ru referred to, which makes people work till 10, 11 at night, where they will not leave the office until their boss has left, where they never get home till 1, 2 in the morning.
As they say, you are married to your office.
You're married to your office. And women, in that case, when the kids come along, are pushed into a kind of cupboard. The house is like a cupboard, and they become invisible. But this is not just in Japan. I think this is something that you'll find all over the world, where a woman's worth is highest when the men are chasing her, when she's not married. And you get married, and then your worth kind of collapses. And then you're just the attachment. So that was a universal theme. So how do you make yourself seen? And I've seen this all over the world. You'll find these women with little kids walking around, looking really bored, but beautifully dressed. I mean, exquisitely. And in Japan, really, when it's exquisite and also very expensive. And the fashion there is to die for. I've never seen anything like it. So I was, A, aesthetically fascinated. And then B, I kind of realized that there was something funny going on. And I went to an exhibition by a photographer called Araki, who's a famous, rather controversial Japanese photographer, who had made all these kind of semi-pornographic pictures of these Japanese women in kimonos, but the kimonos are not properly kind of tied up. They are open, showing a breast or a thigh or a stomach. And at the same time, the kimono has been used to kind of tie her up in a way that she's suspended in. And so it's quite, they're really shocking images because at one level they're kind of erotic, but at another level they're deeply disturbing because of the being tied up is always like being, it's a prisoner. And at the same time, when I saw that, I sensed something universal in that image. And when I asked him, I said, how did you do this? He turned around to me and he says, well, I just put in an ad in a newspaper saying I wanted to take pictures of Japanese housewives.
And so many housewives turned up.
And then he asked them, how would you like me to, how would you like me to photograph you? And they suggested how they wanted to be photographed. So that's when I realized that there's something very special going on. So that led to that book. And the other one, Hidden Forest, was brought out of the whole thing of how community gets destroyed by capitalism. And Japan is a very community-oriented culture. I mean, they're so sensitive to each other. And at the same time, it's also a place, the cities, there's no public space left at all. It's just gone. And the public space is now the shrine or the Buddhist temple. That's where people meet. There are very few places outside that people can meet. And this is, of course, where you see the most rampant that's where capitalism is really flourishing because you have every single bit of land is taken over by real estate developers. And the government itself, the way the inheritance laws are set up, so if you have a house, where if you die in that house, your children are going to have to pay, I think it's the equivalent or double the value, the actual value of that property. So the only way they can do that is to sell. You have to pay 55% of the actual market value of your property, which is why nobody actually ever buys anymore. So anyway, I was exploring all these ideas. I'll stop.
It's interesting you mentioned the word identity. Because Pallavi, in Orienting, you write that Japan is a country with an identity problem. So explain, what is this identity problem? And how does it color Japan's worldview vis-a-vis its interaction with other countries, particularly its Asian neighbors?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll reply to that. But I also wanted to kind of come back to something that Radhika just mentioned about women in Japan. Because this is like a almost universal trope that women in Japan are sort of, oppressed, and it's famously known as an developed OECD country that ranks the lowest when it comes to gender equality. But I have to say that I have a sort of slightly counter view to this. So one thing I found that when Indians kind of come up to me and were like, oh, you live in Japan, isn't the situation of women terrible over there? I used to wonder what planet they inhabit, because the situation for women in Japan is certainly not terrible compared to, say, for example, India. Sometimes I feel that, these interlocutors of mine inhabit a special planet called the planet of the New York Times, because what they are reading is really taken from a different gaze. I think from an Indian gaze, the women in Japan are very well off. Something like 70% of Japanese women are in the workforce, which is much higher than the global average, whereas in India it's 25% and declining. And while it's true that there's a very strong glass ceiling, and as Radhika mentioned, once women have children, given the Japanese culture of overwork and the fact that people have to essentially not have any kind of work-life balance, it does make it difficult for family life, which means that a lot of women move out of the workforce or take lower paid jobs that are more flexible. I would still rather be a Japanese woman than a Japanese man, because at least Japanese women have some kind of life where they can see their children growing up and space to pursue other things in life, whereas Japanese men, the typical salary man, really has a very constrained existence of going to work, staying there, and essentially living their life inside an office building, often even sleeping in dormitories that are attached to the workplaces. And you have a Japanese word called karoshi, which means death by overwork. You have more people that end up dying due to workplace-related stress and chronic diseases than in any other part of the world. And that is not the case with Japanese women. At least their lives are a little bit safer and healthier. But to go back to your original question about Japan being a country with an identity problem, I sort of wrote that because I think that they have this enormous cultural debt to their giant neighbor, China. Zhongguo. The Chinese word for China is Zhongguo, which means the Middle Kingdom. And this was really the center of the universe for East Asia and for many other parts of the world, actually. But for Japan, which was this kind of small archipelagic place on the periphery of this kind of grand Chinese sphere, there was always a sense of being consigned to the rustic margins, and China being this kind of central place. But at the same time, Japan owed its aesthetics, its religion, because Buddhism came from India, but it then reached Japan, mediated by China as Zen Buddhism. Their sense of architecture, their sense of language as well. Japanese uses Chinese characters. So much of it was kind of due to China. So there was this great cultural indebtedness to China. But at the same time, they also wanted to kind of carve out their sense of Japaneseness as separate from that of China. So there's this contradiction of, being indebted to China, but being not China at the heart of their sense of self. And you see that played out in various things, including the fact that the language is incredibly complicated. It uses Chinese characters called kanji, but every kanji can be be pronounced in both a Japanese way and then the Chinese way. So for example, the kanji for mountain, in the Chinese way will be called san. So for example, Mount Fuji is Fuji-san, but then there's the original Japanese way, which is Yama. So you have like two ways of pronouncing everything, and the Japanese way is simply to kind of assert its own sense of self. So I think that the wabi-sabi aesthetics that they developed, the kind of simplicity that today we associate with Japan, was also a way of trying to move away from complicated gold and the kind of very rich cultural traditions of China. And today that very much defines Japan's sense of self. And regarding its contemporary relationships with neighboring countries, let's take China again, you again see that contradictory impulse where it is economically indebted to China. Japanese companies are hugely invested in China, but it also has a sense of being in the Western sphere, and American allies seeing China as a threat, wanting to diversify. Is Japan really Asian? Is it Western? It's always one of those countries that's a little bit of an anomaly, that doesn't fit into one of the regular boxes.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this identity crisis works at both levels. It works at the geopolitical level, but it also works at the personal level. And I think, Radhika, you have explored this in the character that you have created of this architect who relocates to America and then comes to Japan. And I think he's grappling that, am I Japanese or am I American? And will Japanese accept me as a authentic Japanese? So how did you perceive this identity crisis at the personal level, between who's really Japanese?
Well, the identity was not at the center of the thing. I was more really interested in the whole Shinto shrine.
Absolutely.
And also this land grab where, in fact, I saw all over Tokyo the shrines getting dismembered, literally cut up in order to be able to continue to survive. But identity came in. So Kosuke, the hero of the story, is someone who ends up in America kind of by default, because he goes there, he gets a scholarship. But the reason why he goes there is because his girlfriend at university was studying English, and she was crazy about Hollywood and old Hollywood films. And so that's why she wanted to go to America, and he wanted to be with his girlfriend. So then they both applied, and he got the scholarship, and she didn't. And so that was and then she was with, and that kind of started his journey to America. But he ends up staying there because when he stops hearing from his girlfriend and he wants to come back to Japan, and he asks his father, he writes to his father saying, I want to come back. And the father simply says, well, I can't afford it. Because the father is a Shinto priest and there's not much money, and and then his girlfriend ends up killing herself, committing suicide. And so as a result, he always has this sense of anger against his father. But more than that, the anger kind of balloons into another thing, which is in America, he becomes very successful. He studies, he trains to be an architect, but he ends up making sets for films.
On Netflix.
For Netflix, amongst others. And he becomes not just a set designer, but a visual designer. So he designs all the visuals and the special effects of films, and he makes lots of money, but he's not an architect. He's always dealing in the ephemeral, in something which is broken down the moment it's made. And his father, when he'd said he's going to go to America, had said, but why would you go to America? There's nothing old over there. Yes. And so he's always felt, and his father never came to see what he had become, to see what he had created. He gets a beautiful building in Brooklyn, redoes it, makes an absolutely fantastic office for himself. He's extremely successful, but his father doesn't see it. And then when he's in America and he's traveling from seeing his girlfriend from the West Coast to the East Coast, his father passes away. And so there's a lot of anger in him. But behind that, there is this question, a question that I've been asking myself, which is that when you go and live somewhere else, when you go and make roots in another culture, in another society, what part of yourself, it's like cutting out your roots, but is there some root that is an invisible root which you cannot cut? And so, and because I always have this image of that in the Brihadaranya Upanishad, this thing of the upside down tree with the roots in the sky. So, I mean, all these things,
No, very interesting. Now, your second book, you had talked about consumerism, your beautiful shadow, in fact. Kayo, the protagonist, becomes addicted to shopping, and it's all about, how that leads her into a dark hole of, joining, in fact, a mafia gang, actually, just to get some more money. But the interesting thing is that in Japan, consumerism, outright consumerism coexists with Zen minimalism. So what does it speak of this Japanese ability to marry these two extremes and navigate their way between, because we can also see this in the example, on the one hand, it's a very orderly society, but in the evening, the Yakuza takes over the streets in Japan.
Yeah, I mean, the contradictions of Japan are legendary, and it's something that strikes you as a visitor immediately. Because on the one hand, as you said, we have this whole Zen, simplicity, Marie Kondo, and tidiness, and this idea of minimalism. And then on the other hand, you have, Shibuya and Shinjuku, and these enormous crowds, and also otaku culture, which is this kind of subculture. And Japan has got a lot of people that are into special interests and take those special interests to an extreme. So, you do have extremes of different kinds. And you mentioned how do they manage to balance this. I'm not sure they manage to balance it very well. I think that Japan, unlike, because it's a sort of, on the surface, it's less chaotic than, large countries like India or Indonesia. I think we have a sense that somehow it's this very orderly place. But in fact, I think that there's a lot going on subterraneously under the surface. And you have a very extreme culture in Japan, which has manifested itself historically as well, with the kind of nationalism that we saw in the 1930s, for example. And even today, we were talking about the culture of overwork. It has some of the highest suicide rates. It is a culture that has a tendency, I think, to veer towards extremes rather than being something that's very harmonious and balanced, which is often the kind of outsider perspective that one might have as a stereotype.
Radhika, your latest book, The Hidden Forest, also I think one of the central themes is man's relationship with nature. I think also this colonizing, this land grab by the real estate developers, and how do you preserve the authentic, the original forest, for instance. So how do you perceive Japan's, the relationship of the Japanese people with nature? Because Shintoism is all about nature worship also, isn't it?
But that's it, you said it. I mean, Shintoism is about nature worship, and that is a crucial part of that. I think the sensitivity of the Japanese to the seasons, to nature, to trees. There in the Yoyogi Park, when they created the Meiji Shrine, there were people who actually who walked miles and brought saplings to plant that park in that forest. So it's something that's very deeply ingrained in them. And also, I think and if you look at Tokyo from above, from the sky, and in Kyoto and other cities, it's even more evident. You see these patches of green, and you see everywhere that you have these things. But if you look at it, and I did a study, if you look at those pictures from over 10-year gaps, you see how the green gets smaller. And but what's really interesting to me is how it's not simply that those green spaces get smaller, but it's also those spaces are breathing spaces, are places for community, and also places for being alone in public. Now, as a writer, I really feel like that's a really crucial thing for me, for my own mental harmony. To be able to be alone in public, to feel connected, and yet to be on my own with my thoughts is very essential. And those kind of spaces, and I think for even in Japan, where people can't really talk very much about their feelings, where it's not encouraged to talk about that, that's an even more important thing.
Speaking of nature, Pallavi, can you comment on this Japanese obsession with the cherry blossom? And for that 1 month when the cherry blossoms are in bloom, I mean, the Hanami parties are held everywhere. The whole country goes mad.
You know, it's something like a pink Mexican wave that starts in the deep south in Okinawa and then travels all the way up to Hokkaido. And by the end of January, you have this thing called the cherry blossom forecast on television every night, where you've got these announcers with all the breathlessness of sports commentators telling you about how the cherry blossoms are unfurling and, you know, when you can see peak cherry blossom season as it kind of unfolds across the archipelago. And, you know, it really is, I think the few days before the cherry blossoms open, it's almost as though society is holding a collective breath. And then, and then when on the day when you actually have full bloom, it's like there's this sense of release, but also this sense of almost being in a wonderland. There's a special quality to almost, you know, every other person on the street photographing what's happening around them, being in the moment, noticing, you know, the environment that they are in. And I think just that attention to flowers is probably my favorite thing about Japan, if I had to pick one.
So Radhika, when you first arrived in Japan, tell us, what was the biggest culture shock that you experienced there? And did you see any parallels or similarities between Japanese culture and Indian culture?
Actually, when I first got there, I was most struck by the fact that Japan was probably the most different place I had ever been to. It didn't feel similar. It felt actually, I wouldn't say the opposite, but just very alien. And the thing that really I found what kind of somehow the image that crystallized that sense of alienation was the absence of color. Because I was coming from India, and you know, color is so much a part of our existence, and color actually gives so much joy. And to go to Japan, I was there in autumn, when everybody's wearing gray and black. It's gray and black, and that's it. You won't even see brown. And because it was end autumn, so I mean, the brown is there early autumn, but by the end of autumn, it's all gone. It's straight black and gray.
But you have the spectacular colors of the trees.
That's true. The trees are the ones who have the color, but not the people. And so that's why I was kind of... And then the trees came later. They come around November, the color. And so I was very... I mean, I just felt somehow robbed.
By the muted color palette in Japan. Pallavi, now in Orienting, you talk about how Japan treats foreigners. And that's a very interesting chapter in your book, because on the one hand, the Japanese are the most outwardly polite people you can meet on the planet. But then you also have the phenomenon of the gaijin seat, the foreigner seat, which is left stubbornly empty even in a crowded train because nobody wants to sit next to a foreigner. So what does this tell us about the Japanese attitude towards immigration also in general? And are these attitudes changing now in light of the fact that Japan's population will go down to about 90 million by 2050 unless they get foreigners from outside?
Well, exactly. I mean, I think Japan is a country where the immigration debate is, I mean, firstly, they are in a demographic decline. So they are kind of caught in this demographic pincers between aging population and a declining population. And the answer for many other countries that are in similar positions is more immigration. Japan is the one country where it's much more popular to suggest more robots than more immigrants. But it hasn't always worked. So, for example, they tried very hard to replace human beings in old age homes, in nursing homes, of which there are many. But, I mean, people don't want to be lifted up by robots, and they don't want robots sort of looking after them. And I think it's becoming increasingly clear to the Japanese themselves that some amount of immigration is going to be necessary. So they remain very averse to a political asylum. They have almost no political asylum, unlike other OECD countries. I think they approve something like 20 or 30 cases every year. But they are going through a sort of reckoning with economic migrants. And there are now schemes of trying to get people, particularly from Southeast Asia, the Philippines and Vietnam, to come in and work in specific sectors. But there remains a negative attitude towards immigration in general. Going back to the very first answer about the normalization of civic civic consciousness. I think that's also partly been possible because it's quite a homogenous society, or at least that's the story that they tell themselves, that because we are Japanese, we share a certain set of values. And there is this sense that once you have immigrants, it will dilute what makes Japan special. And some of these things like the lost and found and all these things that we talk about being unique to Japan, this idea that if you are not Japanese, that's going to muddy the pot. So yeah.
Okay, final questions before we throw it open to the audience. Radhika, what can we learn from Japan?
That's a big question.
That's a really big
but still,
question.
what are your thoughts? I mean, since having lived there, what are the lessons that we can imbibe from Japan? I mean, one, of course, is the obvious one is their sense of, space for others and, looking at the whole community rather than individuality.
I think you can, for me, it was more about the two things. Personally, it was about silence. I think actually, oddly enough, silence can often fix a lot of conflictual situations.
And in India, we have trucks saying horn, please.
And I mean, that was a real lesson that, just being able to be, and it actually takes a lot of self-discipline to be silent, to not say something, especially if you're upset. And to also feel, and it requires thinking of seeing the other person as a person. That was for me my personal takeaway.
Yep, no, that's very interesting. And Pallavi, what does the future hold for Japan?
You're not pulling any punches with the last questions. What does the future hold for Japan? I mean, Japan, I think, needs to change, and I think Japan is aware it needs to change. It's a little bit like an upper-class spinster, sort of tut-tutting at the young upstarts of China and India. But the problem is that it sort of lacks dynamism, and they have had for long this idea that the world will become more Japanese, but I think it's becoming increasingly clear that Japan will have to become more global, but this is something that they still struggle with. And so we'll have to see. And I mean, there's also the whole geopolitical angle about how, whether they rethink their traditional stance, or at least their post-Second World War stance of pacifism, and whether Shinzo Abe's legacy of trying to force constitutional change that would allow them to have their own army and so on, how that evolves. But certainly, they're in a holding pattern, and they have been in a holding pattern for a long time, and it's not clear how they're going to break out of that pattern at the moment.
So thank you, Pallavi, and thank you, Radhika, for sharing your thoughts and these insights on Japan. I'm sure the audience would have a number of questions. I don't know how many of you have actually been to Japan. How many people have been to Japan? Can I have? Oh my God, okay. So a lot of people have been to Japan. But let's open this up to the audience. And okay, this lady here, can we start with her? Perfect. 8 minutes, okay. Yeah, please.
Hi.
Short questions, please.
There are a lot of good things about Japan, which we just spoke. Their civic sense, being considerate to other people, and they're teaching the kids to make the place clean right from when they're little. Of course, it's amazing, and I wish we could all be like that. But at some level, do you think it's a bit too regimented? And is it, or are the people really happy there? I mean, they are very proper, if I may use that word. But are they happy, is my question.
Interesting question.
Is it for anyone in particular?
Yeah. I think both of you can answer. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question, and as somebody as an outsider who lived there, it's difficult to answer that without essentializing. But just looking at the facts, I mean, they have a very high suicide rate, but that also has to do with a certain cultural cachet that suicide has, and different conceptions of what constitute happiness. I do think that there's a kind of orientalizing that we've seen around Japan in the last few years, with this the propagation of concepts like ikigai, ikigai, that Japan is somehow this ancient art of Japanese happiness. And in fact, you rarely find people who have actually found this great balance between their purpose in life and monetary recompense and the things that ikigai would have us believe. And it's closer to the kind of society of extremes under the surface calm that I was talking about before. It is a regimented society. I do think that it needs more flexibility, not just in terms for their mental health, but also for greater economic dynamism.
Radhika, your take? Are the Japanese happy?
I don't think that's really a value for them. I think if you ask them, are you happy, they would look a bit worried and nervous.
Different conceptions of what happiness actually is, even.
I think a more telling statistic is 64% of Japanese males between the ages of 18 and 35 have never had sex and do not want to have sex. 64%. That's an interesting one.
And the women aren't getting married either.
No, not at all. That's
My company does extensive business with Japan. My question is, how do the Japanese expatriates stationed in the various Sogo Soshas across the world like living in those countries vis-a-vis Japan?
Sorry, was it to me?
Yeah.
And sorry, what was the question? How do people like living where compared to
No,
Japan?
Japanese expatriates working in many other countries in their Sogo Soshas like living there vis-a-vis Japan or what is
So I get it. But I'll answer that question with regards to India, because this was something that I spoke to a lot of Japanese about, and also spoke to associations in Japan that deal with businesses, Japanese businesses in India. So they deal on a regular basis with Japanese expatriates here. And the feedback I got was that they find it befuddling, that they find it exhausting, that it's like if they get posted to India, it's like drawing the short straw, and that like you have ghettos, I mean, this is not unique to Japan. So Indians, when they live abroad, also form their sort of Indian ghettos wherever they are. But the Japanese do that to a large extent, where they're trying to sort of cocoon themselves from the real India, as it were, which is something that, upper class Indians also do. So we can't just blame the Japanese. But for example, they do have, hotels, including, I read that there was a hotel in Bangalore, which was run by Japanese for Japanese, and they actually did not allow foreigners, including Indians, in. Almost like a throwback to the British times when it was like, no dogs and Indians allowed. And this was then struck as not a real rule, but just something that was kind of understood. And eventually, when the Indians really insisted, they were allowed in. But this idea that of, Japanese uniqueness, exceptionalism, and somehow the fact that foreigners or outsiders might dilute or upset that harmony, which is one of the reasons behind the anti-immigration strain, also I think would play out in the Japanese expat experience.
I think one telling statistic is that young Japanese people are no longer traveling outside Japan. The number of Japanese students at Harvard, for instance, Japan used to be number 1. It's now number 13 or something like that. Indians are number 1 there.
That's also because so many others are growing in bigger numbers.
No, but what I was told is the Japanese young people say, we are living in paradise, why do we need to go to any other country? That attitude is also there. Okay, we have time for one more question.
Can you please shed some light on racism in Japan, especially with reference to Indians?
Interesting. Radhika, please.
there is that, but I think as Pallavi said and Vikas said, that it comes out of this sense of them, they feel that they're different and they're special. And there is racism, well, it's there, but then it's everywhere, frankly. It's not like we're not racist.
We have Mr. Prem Shankar Jha asking a question.
Thank you.
Yes, it's working.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. There's one issue or one thing that struck me. I've lived in Japan for 8 months in the 1950s. Then I've lived off and on in Japan for 4 years because my daughter, I used to go visit her. One thing did not change to me, that this society is driven ultimately by a sense of honor. That if you lose your honor, then you've lost everything. I remember very well that about 10 or 15 years after the more than 10 years after the Second World War ended, there was a Minister for Agriculture in Japan, and he was found to have been corrupt. And he just jumped off the top of the ministry and committed suicide. And that, I think, didn't happen while I was there, but as well as I was very interested by this. And then, of course, the great thing of Yukio Mishima. You know, I think that the concept of honor, a society built around the concept of honor, is so, to me, so impressive. It's also repressive, but it is phenomenally impressive, particularly because we belong now to a society in which honor is totally at a discount.
I think that's a very valid point. In fact, if you look at this TV series called Shogun, and if you look at Japanese history, you know, the most, what should I say, painful form of suicide is seppuku, where you insert a dagger into your chest and then carve it out into your tummy. Can you imagine? And then, I mean, samurai was doing it regularly because if they lost honor, that was the only way to sort of atone for it, you know, by committing seppuku. So I agree with you. I think honor is really a cornerstone of Japanese society. Whether it's still enduring, I mean, modern day...
No, I mean, absolutely. You still have occasions of ministers or corporations when they sort of found out to be corrupt,
Yes.
of, you know, people stepping down immediately, which is, you know, not something that would happen in many other cultures where people defend themselves shamelessly till the bitter end. So you do still have that sense of honor, which, as you correctly said, traces its origins to samurai culture and, you know, the code of Bushido. And what Radhika said earlier about happiness not being like the main value around which society is constructed, I think it's constructed around honor rather than happiness, which is what explains, I think, a lot of the psyche.
And
I'm getting the signal that it's the honorable thing to end the session now. So please thank Pallavi Aiyar and Radhika Jha.